G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.33, We Three Kings, 2019 Epiphany Special.
We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts we traverse afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star. Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. Born a king on Bethlehem plain, though thy brings her, crown him again, king forever, ceasing never over us all to reign. Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. Frankincense to offer have I, incense souls a deity nigh, prayer and praising, all men raising, worship him God most high. Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. Myrrh is mine, its bitter perfume breathes a life of gathering gloom, sorrowing, sighing, bleeding, dying, sealed in the stone cold tomb. Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. Glorious now, behold him arise, King and God and sacrifice. Heaven sings, Alleluia, Alleluia, the earth replies. Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star of royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. Star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light.
In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I covered Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. I move on from Luke to Matthew. Luke spends a luxuriant 120 verses on the nativity of Jesus. Matthew pens a third that number. Matthew begins his gospel with, and I quote, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew then regales us with an elaborate genealogy of Joseph, the husband of Jesus' mother Mary. Matthew divides his genealogy into three parts: 14 generations from Abraham to King David, 14 from David to the exile, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Magic numbers. The Jews of Matthew's time loved genealogies. The last history books in the Old Testament, Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, are stuffed with endless lists of who fathered whom, verse after jury verse. Matthew's genealogy couples his own book back to these older works. Matthew emphasises two links in his chain: Abraham and King David. Joseph is the direct descendant of the first Jew, Abraham, and he is the direct descendant of God's chosen king, David. Matthew traces the middle 14 of his genealogy through the kings of Judah, blithely ignoring a few kings to make a neat 14 generations. His final 14 names, those after the exile, are largely mysteries. Matthew's genealogy mentions 4 women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah. These women are just dropped into the list as the wives of their husbands. The patriarch Judah seduced his daughter-in-law Tamar. The Old Testament can't work out if she was a Gentile, a convert, or a Hebrew. Joshua saved the Canaanite Rahab when she became a Hebrew spy during the conquest of Canaan. The Moabite Ruth converted to Judaism to become King David's grandmother. The wife of Uriah is better known as the Bathsheba that David so coveted. She is King Solomon's mother. No Jew of the 1st century would include women into a genealogy, let alone women with backgrounds less than impeccable. Why did Matthew decide to do so? We don't know. Matthew spends most of his first chapter setting up Jesus' descent through Joseph from King David. Matthew then drops a bombshell. Joseph is not the father of Jesus. Matthew explodes a bigger bomb by announcing that Mary is pregnant out of wedlock. Quote, Matthew 1:18. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the Parthenos shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. End quote. We have 2 intertwined issues here. First, Joseph is not really the father of Jesus. So what was the point of the elaborate Davidic genealogy? Neither Matthew nor his readers were fools. Of course they saw the problem. Both author and audience must have believed that adoption into Joseph's Davidic family was just as good as natural birth. Modern Christians prefer not to discuss the issue. Second, Matthew and Luke state that Mary is a Parthenos, the Greek word for virgin. This is a perplexing proclamation. None of the other 25 books of the New Testament mention the virgin birth. The Apostle Paul says 2 things that might, just might, indicate that he was wary of the virgin birth story. Quote, Galatians 4:4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law. Romans 1:3. I give you the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. End quote. At the end of the passage from Matthew I just quoted, the evangelist cites a passage in Isaiah as prophesying that a Messiah shall be born of a virgin. This is the first of many prophecies about Jesus that the Gospel of Matthew finds in the Old Testament. Many Christians regard this as the most important prophecy about Jesus in the Old Testament. Let's look at the book of Isaiah. Around 730 BC, King Ahaz of Judah and the prophet Isaiah are engaged in argument. King Ahaz is under attack by two of his neighbours. Ahaz consults Isaiah. What should he do? Isaiah offers a cryptic sign about some young woman and her son. Quote, Isaiah 7:10. The Lord spoke further to Ahaz. Ask for a sign from the Lord your God. But Ahaz replied, I will not ask, and I will not test the Lord. Listen, house of David, Isaiah retorted. Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman is with child, and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns to reject the bad and choose the good, people will be feeding on curds and honey. For before the lad knows to reject the bad and choose the good, the ground whose two kings you dread shall be abandoned. End quote. It is not clear whether the sign Isaiah refers to is the woman's pregnancy, the child's birth, his name, or his diet. Nor is it clear when the sign comes to pass. Where Christian translations place the young woman and her child into some indefinite future, Jewish translations locate them in the here and now. The Hebrew verbs are in the past tense. The woman has already conceived. The birth is pending. Most Jewish scholars take the passage as a prosaic reference to the king's wife, who will bear the great king Hezekiah. Now, for more on Hezekiah and his importance, check out episode 1.51, Hezekiah, Father of Biblical Religion. The Hebrew word used in the passage is alma, young woman. The usual Hebrew word for virgin is bethulah. Now, you could argue that in those days, young women were meant to be virgins. Still, the ambiguity of the term might be better served by the English word maid or maiden. Matthew used the Greek language version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where the word alma is translated parthenos, which in Greek unambiguously means virgin. Some modern English translations use the expression young woman with a note that it can also be virgin. Other translations use virgin with a note that it can also be young woman. Conservative Christians favour translations that preference virgin, such as the New International Version and the New Living Translation. Virgin births were common in pagan religions, but utterly alien to Judaism. No Jewish tradition says that a Messiah must be born of a virgin. Matthew's tortured interpretation of Isaiah was unique, one of the very few novelties in Christian thought not found in the lush forest that is the Second Temple literature. And here's a point. Nothing in Christian theology depends on Jesus' mother being a virgin. Although theologically redundant, Mary's virginity very soon became entrenched in Christian doctrine. A century after the death of Jesus, writers in the young but burgeoning Christian movement had to defend this doctrine against outsiders. Even they acknowledged that in Christian communities, the doctrine of the virgin birth was controversial. Pagan and Jewish writers hammered Mary's virginity as a weak point in Christian doctrine. They derided Mary's virginity as ludicrous, a pathetic attempt to disguise the fact that Jesus was a bastard. Matthew ramps up the action in his second chapter, after Jesus' birth. Where Luke begins his story in Nazareth, Matthew does so in Bethlehem. A mysterious posse of potentates from parts unknown arrives at the palace of King Herod the Psychopath, seeking the newborn king of the Jews. Quote, Matthew 2:1. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet." End quote. That last line is a reference to chapter 5 of the prophet Micah, a reference Jews hold is to King David, who was born in Bethlehem. Quote, Micah 5:1, "And you, O Bethlehem of Ephrath, least among the clans of Judah, from you one shall come forth to rule Israel for me, one whose origin is from of old, from ancient times." End quote. The Greek word magi means something like astrologer or wizard. Matthew's Jewish readers would have regarded them as we do Wiccans, somewhere between delightful, dodgy, and disreputable. Definitely not kosher. It never occurs to the Magi that asking directions from the current king, the infamously homicidal Herod, might be a bad idea. So much for being wise men, the usual translation of Magi into English. The Magi foreshadow the mission to the Gentiles and Jesus' rejection by his own people. The only other time that Jesus is called King of the Jews is at his crucifixion. The royal title is never used again in the rest of the New Testament, nor by the early church. King Herod is now asking questions. This does not bode well. Quote, Matthew 2:7. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men, and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen, until it stopped over the place where the child was. On entering the house, they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. End quote. Matthew does not say that there were 3 wise men, only that the travelling troupe give Jesus 3 grand birthday presents. Perhaps a dozen wise men threw their sagely salaries into the pot for the birthday boy. If you read the first 2 chapters of Matthew carefully, you find that he says nothing about the events of the day of Jesus' birth, Christmas. Matthew really begins his story of Jesus after his birth. No mention of Nazareth, no shepherds or angels, and a house, not an inn. To Matthew, the big deal is the revelation of the newborn king to the world, to the wise men. In Western Christianity, the day of the wise men's visit is known as Epiphany, celebrated on January the 6th. We all know the 18th century carol, The 12 Days of Christmas. The first day of Christmas is the 25th of December. The last is Twelfth Night, the day before Epiphany. The more traditional amongst us hold that night as the last evening that you can display Christmas bunting without committing a social faux pas. Epiphany is a festival that few Catholics and even fewer Protestants care about. The Eastern churches hold the day in higher esteem. They agree that Epiphany celebrates Jesus' first public appearance, but they think that this debut was made when Jesus was baptized by John in the Jordan, not when the wise men made goo-goo noises over his manger. Those Eastern churches that follow the Julian calendar put Epiphany not on our January the 6th, but on our January the 13th, which is January the 6th to them. Where was I? Ah, yes. God sends dream warnings to the wise men and to Joseph to get the hell out of town. Herod the Great is gunning for this so-called king of the Jews. Joseph and his family flee to Egypt. Herod kills all the infants in Bethlehem, the infamous massacre of the innocents. As I recounted in episode 2.15, The Rise and Ruin of the Maccabees, Herod murdered some of his own children because he thought that they were threats. That he would slaughter all the infants of a small village is entirely within character. Sometime after Herod's death, God appears in another few dreams to inform Joseph that the coast is clear. Matthew says nothing about the time interval. It could have been years. But do not return to Judea, says God. Judea is ruled by Herod the Great's capricious and cruel son Archelaus. God's advice is sage. God directs Joseph instead to Galilee. Galilee was run by another of Herod's sons, Antipas. Jesus spent almost his whole life under the rule of Antipas. Antipas will pop up many times in our story. He wasn't actively evil like his brother Archelaus, but almost endearingly incompetent. You can hear more about Archelaus and Antipas in episode 2.20, Herod's Heirs. Joseph settles in the Galilean hamlet of Nazareth, a country and a town unknown to him. According to Matthew, Joseph had lived his life in the Judean village of Bethlehem, 2 hours' walk from the pubs of Jerusalem. Nazareth was in the middle of nowhere, more like 2 days than 2 hours from Jerusalem. Archaeological evidence shows it was a wretched place. A population of a few hundred lived in caves, partly natural and partly dug out. A really well-off Nazarene homeowner boasted a leather awning in front of their cave. Matthew finishes his account abruptly, with Joseph's repatriation from Egypt to Galilee. Matthew then leaps forward decades to introduce the adult Jesus and his encounter with John the Baptist. I'll cover that in my next episode. Almost every nativity play, film, Christmas carol, and modern retelling of the birth of Jesus mashes together the 2 accounts of Matthew and Luke. Let's not forget how different they are. In Matthew, the story is told from Joseph's point of view. Joseph, the descendant of David, is the focus. Joseph is the one who receives the annunciation from God. In Luke, the story is all about Mary. God appears to Mary, not Joseph. Luke spends a lot of time on Mary's relative Elizabeth and her son John the Baptist. Matthew knows nothing about all that. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is born in his family home in Bethlehem in Judea, in fulfillment of a prophecy by Micah. No shepherds and no angels. The future king of the Jews receives homage from the wise men. Joseph and his family flee to Egypt after learning of Herod's plot against them. The Holy Family eventually return, but not to Judea, run by the tyrant Herod Archelaus. The family moves to the hillbilly town of Nazareth in Galilee, beyond Archelaus' control. In the Gospel of Luke, the story starts in Mary's hometown of Nazareth in Galilee. The Romans compel the family to move to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem in Judea for a census. The town is overcrowded with other Jews, aggravated about all this travel for Roman bureaucratic reasons. With a dismal lack of foresight, the family ends up in lackluster accommodation. There, the baby Jesus is acclaimed by shepherds and angels, no wise men. The family hang around Bethlehem for 6 weeks, until the purification sacrifice at the temple. Then Luke goes blank. The next time we hear of the Holy Family in Luke's Gospel, they are living in Nazareth. In Matthew, John the Baptist first appears as a figure in Jesus' adult life. In Luke, we meet the Baptist before he is born and learn that his story is intertwined with that of Jesus. The stories of Matthew and Luke are not contradictory, but you do have to bend yourself into some challenging yoga positions to fit them together. Why does each evangelist leave out so much that the other records? As ever, we don't know. Like Matthew, Luke also presents a genealogy, but he tucks it away in his 3rd chapter, after he introduces the adult Jesus being baptized by John. Where Matthew works forward from Abraham, Luke works backward from Jesus. Quote, Luke 3:23. Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work. He was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mathat, the son of Levi, and on and on and on and on and on, son of Methuselah, son of Enoch, son of Jared, son of Mahalalel, son of Canaan, son of Enos, son of Seth, son of Adam, son of God. End quote. Oh boy. The genealogies have little in common. That is not an issue. You can trace family trees any number of ways. Matthew's family tree is full of kings. Luke's not so much. But the devil is in the details. Matthew traces the line from David through his son Solomon. He names Joseph's father as Jacob. Luke traces the line through David's son Nathan and names Joseph's father as Eli. We have one more account of Jesus' birth, the Proto-Evangelion of James. It is also known as the Gospel of James, or the Infancy Gospel of James. And that's the name I'll stick to. It purports to be written by Jesus' brother, James the Just. The Gospel of James was widely read and enjoyed in the East. The West ignored the book. The Gospel held that Jesus had many stepbrothers, the sons of Joseph. The Western Church asserted that Jesus had cousins, not stepbrothers. Scholars are uncertain when it was penned. Perhaps around the year 225, when the Roman Empire was beginning to frazzle at the edges. The first Christian catacomb paintings date from this period. Christians were not actively persecuted at the time, but they were carefully watched. Another idea is that the Gospel was written around 350, when Christianity had become a state-funded political force. We have no idea who wrote the Gospel, but we do know why. The Gospel of James gives us a biography of Jesus' mother Mary. The Gospel illuminates the dark places in the canonical Gospels. Like the prophet Samuel's mother, Mary's mother Anna cannot conceive a child. God answers Anna's prayer with a daughter. Anna dedicates Mary to God. When Mary turns 3, her parents deliver her to the priests of the temple. Under the care of the clerics, Mary grows up in absolute purity, fed every day by the angels. No pedophile priests in 1st century Judea, thank goodness. When Mary reaches puberty, the elderly priests are thrown into a panic. They know that God is revolted by menstruation. Mary must leave the temple post-haste. The priests palm her off on the elderly Joseph, a man who already has many children. A barely pubescent girl is forced to marry an old man. And before you tut that this sort of thing only happens today in third world countries, reflect on the laws of some of the American states. More states than you might think have provisions that allow girls as young as 12 to marry. The Gospel of James paints a strikingly different description of Jesus' birth. Jesus is born in a cave. In this passage, time stands still for his father Joseph. Quote, Gospel of James 18:1. And Joseph found a cave and led Mary there. and stationed his sons to watch her, while he went to find a Hebrew midwife. Then Joseph wandered, but he did not wander. And I looked up to the peak of the sky and saw it standing still. With utter astonishment I saw it. Even the birds of the sky were not moving. And I looked at the ground and saw a bowl lying there, and workers reclining. And their hands were in the bowl, and chewing, they were not chewing. And picking food up, they were not picking it up. And putting food in their mouths, they were not putting food in their mouths. Rather, all their faces were looking up. And I saw the rushing current of the river, and I saw goats and their mouths resting in the water, but they were not drinking. And suddenly everything was replaced by the ordinary course of events." End quote. Let's draw all the Gospel accounts together and see if we can work out where Jesus was born and when he was born. The answer to the first question seems obvious. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, hang on, say modern scholars. After the birth of Jesus, Bethlehem never receives another Gospel look-in. Throughout the rest of the New Testament and all the earliest Christian authors, no one ever calls him Jesus of Bethlehem. He is always Jesus of Nazareth. Matthew and Luke invent different reasons to explain that. Matthew says that the family was originally from Judean Bethlehem, but ended up as refugees who found a safe haven in Galilean Nazareth. Luke says that the family was originally from Nazareth, but were compelled to travel to Bethlehem for a Roman census. That makes no sense. The whole point of a census is to obtain data about human geography. How many people live in this town? What do they own? What do they farm? And what taxes should they pay? Forcing people to move to their ancestral towns defeats the whole point of a census. Modern scholars are united that Jesus was born in Nazareth. The Bethlehem story was shoehorned in to justify citing the prophet Micah as predicting Jesus' birth in that town. When was Jesus born? That knowledge was lost by the 2nd century. The influential Christian theologian Clement of Alexandria was active at the end of the placid and prosperous golden age of the empire, around the year 190. He admitted that he had no idea of either the year or the day of Jesus' birth. We might be able to do a little better. The key datum is the death of Herod the Great, well attested as sometime in 4 BC. Matthew describes Herod's maniacal quest to kill the infants of Bethlehem. Now, not just the babies. Let's say that Herod was looking for males up to the age of 2. That would place Jesus' birth sometime between, say, 6 and 4 BC. Matthew gives another reinforcing clue. The Holy Family flee from Herod to Egypt. They return to Galilee, not Judea, to avoid its ruler Herod Archelaus. Archelaus was deposed by the Romans in 6 AD. So the Holy Family returned to Nazareth before then. At first glance, Luke provides some solid facts. He dates Jesus' birth to a universal Roman census conducted by the Emperor Augustus, while Publius Sulpicius Quirinius was governor of the major province of Syria. Quirinius was the hapless bureaucrat, lumbered with oversight of the petty regions of the Jews. Big problem. For a start, there is no evidence for an empire-wide census. Second, we have good evidence that Quirinius was governor from 6 to 7 AD, 10 years after Herod's death. From other passages in Luke, the evangelist clearly believes that Jesus and John the Baptist were born during the reign of Herod the Great. Luke has got his facts wrong about Quirinius and his census. So we are back to Matthew. Jesus was born sometime between 6 and 4 BC. His family was back in Nazareth, if they had ever left it, before 6 AD. When he returned to Nazareth, Jesus could have been anything from a toddler to a tweenie. Luke is the only gospel to give us a story about Jesus' boyhood, before he meets John the Baptist. As usual, Jesus and his family are depicted as observant Jews. Quote, "Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. When his parents could not find him, they returned to Jerusalem. After 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard of them were amazed at his understanding. His mother said to him, 'Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you.' He said to them, 'Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?' But they did not understand what he said to them." End quote. Observant Jews Joseph and Mary may be, but diligent parents they are not. How on earth did they fail to notice Jesus' absence on the 2-day donkey trip home? The generous explanation is that Joseph was carting around so many of his children by earlier wives that Jesus got lost in the throng. But you might have expected Mary to notice the absence of her only child. The story of Jesus instructing his elders is strikingly similar to a tale that our old friend, the Jewish Roman historian Josephus, tells about himself. Josephus and Luke were contemporaries. As Josephus bombastically relates, quote, "I made mighty proficiency in the improvements of my learning, and appeared to have both a great memory and understanding. Moreover, when I was a child, and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priests and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together, in order to know my opinion about the accurate understanding of points of the law." End quote. We have one other source for Jesus' youth, the infancy gospel of Thomas. The gospel was already known to Christians who lived in the heyday of the Roman Empire, around the year 150, 4 generations after the death of Jesus. The infancy gospel was in fact a bestseller for centuries. We have hundreds of manuscript fragments from the High Middle Ages, written in many different languages. The infancy gospel of Thomas was the Harry Potter of its time, and that time lasted for 1,000 years. I am disquieted by the celebrity of that gospel. Let's take one story from it. Quote, "Infancy Gospel of Thomas, 12:1. And Joseph saw Jesus' prudence and understanding, and wished him not to be unacquainted with letters. So he handed him over to another schoolmaster. And the schoolmaster said, 'Say Alpha.' But the boy said, 'First tell me what is the beta, and I will tell you what the alpha is.' Becoming irritated, the teacher struck him. And Jesus cursed him, and the teacher fell and died. And the boy went home to his parents. And Joseph called his mother and commanded her, 'Do not let him out of the house, so that those who make him angry may not die.'" End quote. Well, that's a little disturbing. Here's another one. Quote, "Infancy Gospel of Thomas, 3:1. While Jesus was going from there with his father Joseph, a child running tore into his shoulder, and instantly he died." End quote. No, I'm not finished. I just can't resist this stuff. Quote, "Infancy Gospel of Thomas, 2:1. And the son of Annas the scribe had come with Joseph, and taking a willow twig, the son of Annas, destroyed the pools and drained out the water which Jesus had gathered together. And he dried up their gatherings. And Jesus, seeing what had happened, said to him, Your fruit shall be without root, and your shoot shall be dried up like a branch scorched by a strong wind. And instantly the son of Annas withered. End quote. Jesus' story is unwritten in the 4 Gospels between his 12th birthday and his encounter with John the Baptist. His father Joseph leaves the narrative. The Gospels of Luke and John say nothing of how Jesus made a living in his youth. The Gospel of Mark tells us that Jesus was a tekton. That's Greek for someone who works with their hands. English language Bibles translate that as carpenter. But the Greek term is more akin to tradesman and encompasses a variety of occupations. For all we know, Jesus could have been an electrician. A century after Jesus' death, the church fathers had decided that Jesus was definitely a carpenter. The symbolism tying his occupation with the wood of the cross was just too strong to ignore. In the next episode of The History in the Bible, I explore the first stupendous event in Jesus' ministry, his baptism by the most problematic person depicted in the New Testament, John the Baptist.